Hey everyone, this lecture covers chapters 3 and 4 in the Popple and Leninger book. With the end of this lecture, we'll talk about the history, sort of the relevant questions for the history section of the the paper. So chapters 3 and 4, and then sort of after that, sort of deal with different ways to sort of analyze policy. And frankly, there's a lot of different ways to analyze policy, and it depends on in which methods one chooses depends on, in large part, who the final consumer of said evaluation is going to be. Oftentimes, politicians are interested in very different things than, say, an ordinary citizen would be. Sometimes different professions are interested, like social workers or nurses or physicians or something like that, might be interested in very different kinds of policy questions than, say, an average citizen would be. So it depends in large part. The type of policy analysis done depends in large part on who is going to consume sort of that information at the end. Some of the methods that we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes are descriptive analysis, process analysis, and then sort of an overall evaluation. What you're really doing in the paper for this class is sort of a descriptive analysis, and it's a descriptive analysis from a couple of different orientations. There's a sort of historical orientation. That's obviously what we're going to talk about here in this lecture. And then there's sort of other portions of the paper, a social analysis, economic analysis, and so on and so forth, that sort of think about the policy kind of in a different way. And so because we can think about policies sort of in all of these different ways, and the meanings of the outcomes have sort of different meanings, some people might judge policies to be incredibly effective. On the other hand, some people might judge those very same policies to be complete failures, and sometimes for very similar reasons. Let me give you an example. So the Affordable Care Act, when it was passed under the Obama administration, was heralded by Democrats as a runaway success. And part of the reason was that it extended health care to a huge number of people who had been previously uninsured. So the fact that it had insured more people was an incredible success in the eyes of Democrats. On the other hand, in the eyes of Republicans, the policy was a complete and utter failure, and that was because it penalized people for not having health insurance, and so it sort of infringed upon the boundaries of liberty, and it allegedly raised costs. And so for those reasons, it was a complete failure from sort of a Republican point of view. So anyway, so the reason I'm saying all this is that people have different goals in mind with policy, and looking at it from the different perspectives, we can evaluate policies to be either failures or successes. And in fact, we could, from some perspectives, evaluate a policy to be a success, and from another perspective, evaluate a policy to be a complete failure. And that's fine. You actually may find that's sort of the conclusion of your paper. So this chapter 3 is a little confusing in the Popple book, because they're actually talking about sort of much more formal and quantitative methods of policy analysis. We're, like I said, really doing sort of a descriptive analysis of the policy. We're going to be reporting on information that you've found in in the literature. Nevertheless, they include this section so that you sort of understand how to digest the information that you find in the literature. So a content analysis. So let me back up for a second. So these four different sort of analyses here The only one I'm going to be asking you to do is sort of a historical analysis, but like I said, Popple includes these because this is sort of a way to analyze policy that you're going to encounter as you're consuming sources. These four different types of policy analysis are all done sort of at different points in time relative to when a policy is passed. And I'm gonna talk through those here in just a second. So a content analysis is really done at the same time a policy is passed. And a content analysis simply asks, does the content of the policy line up with the problems it's intending to address? A choice analysis, on the other hand, is done before a policy is passed. And a choice analysis, as you may be able to surmise from sort of the name choice analysis, simply helps people choose between two or more existing alternatives. So the sort of fundamental questions to ask in a choice analysis are listed there in those 4 bullet points: bases of allocation, types of benefits, delivery structure, and financing of benefits. And so the bases of allocation asks who is going to benefit and how do we decide who gets to benefit from the policy. So what's the basis for allocating these resources that we have here in this policy? The types of benefits are what is distributed. So is it cash aid? Is it in-kind aid? Is it a new construction project? That's sort of the what. So the bases of allocation are the who. The types of benefits are the what. Then the delivery structure sort of asks how. How are we going to be delivering the benefits? Are we mailing people a check? Are we loading money onto a sort of debit card, as would be the case with sort of SNAP or something like that each month? And then the financing of benefits is sort of another how question. How are we going to pay for this? And so that, like I said, is intended to help people or help policymakers make a decision between two existing policies. A comparative analysis then is done after a policy is passed, and it compares two or more existing policies in 2 different areas to see what the differences are in those 2 policies. Or in the effectiveness of those 2 policies. A historical analysis, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth here, actually sort of looks at the development of the problem and the policy over time. And as I said, we'll get into some more of those questions here in a second. A process analysis is sort of the counterweight, I suppose, is a good word, to a content analysis. So the process analysis asks, how did this policy develop? It sort of follows the process of the development and evolution of a policy, and it's often sort of focused on political actors, elected officials, bureaucrats. So bureaucrats would be people who are sort of employed by the government, professionally employed by the government. They're not elected. Media, special interest groups, political action committees, so on and so forth. And as a few minutes ago, or think back to a few minutes ago when I said that different people have different sort of interests in policy evaluations. Or in the outcomes of policy. Sometimes elected officials are simply interested in passing a policy that's sort of beneficial to their area. It might bring jobs. It might locate a federal office building or something like that in the area. And in that sense, a process analysis would sort of determine whether or not a politician has views a policy as successful. Moving on here. So let me just put myself up here. So oftentimes, sort of the most classic forms of policy studies are really evaluations. Um, did the policy result in changes that we wanted? Did it improve the quality of life? Did it reduce the extent of a social problem? That kind of thing. Um, this is a pretty rigorous quantitative evaluation, and these kinds of things are some of what you'll be consuming. These kinds of reports are some of what you'll be consuming when you start to think about, say, the social and economic analysis of the policy. The one of the interesting questions that always sort of is answered by the sort of rigorous quantitative evaluations of policy are, what are the intended and unintended consequences? All policies have sort of stated explicit goals, and they also have latent goals, but they also have sort of these unintended consequences. Maybe things accidentally raise the cost of some good, or maybe it resulted in pollution of some kind. Oftentimes, people will use the unintended consequences as a reason to oppose a policy. They'll say, "Well, it's got so many unintended consequences that we shouldn't pass it." Um, for example, Republicans, if we think back to the Affordable Care Act, thought that it would raise the cost of health care for everyone. So that was an unintended consequence that they were trying to avoid. All right, this is so. Let's talk about sort of the historical analysis here for a second. And at the end of these couple of slides here is when we'll talk about what goes in sort of the historical analysis of the paper, or portion of the paper. So history really sort of, especially in social work, it sort of gives us a deeper understanding of sort of the evolution of policy, criticisms of policy, um, strategies used in sort of the policymaking process. How do people advocate for policies? How do people oppose policies? What's that political rhetoric look like? It also tells us a lot about sort of the causes of social problems. So if we study history, we can sort of see the development of historical problems over time. We can see what's exacerbated social problems, and we can see um, what sort of reduced or alleviated social problems. So some of the things that we've talked about before are in previous lectures are the relief of the colonial, relief of poor relief in colonial times, um, the use of orphan asylums and policies for people living with disabilities. And so we have the benefit of being able to look back on some of these kinds of programs, if we can sort of call them programs, and looking at sort of, uh, were these things failures, or were these things successful, or what components of them were failures and what components of them were successful. Let me just move myself here so you can kind of see everything. The crucial task in sort of consuming history is developing a series of guiding questions, and oftentimes those guiding questions sort of are along the lines of, did this program work or did this policy work at reducing a particular social problem, or was it a failure? And then there's a similar kind of question that sort of asks, what are the conditions that sort of exacerbated said social policy, and what are the conditions that sort of exacerbated said social problem, and what are the things that sort of um, ameliorated it? Um, the sort of sources of history um, are often some of the same places that we're going to look for other sources of information about policy. So social work journals, there's often sections in some of those think tank documents that have sort of some historical information. So that would often be like in the introduction or the lit review section of a professional report or a journal. We also have sort of first-hand accounts, journals, and like personal journals and diaries and things like that. History, though, can be really really tough to interpret sometimes. We can oversimplify it, and that really means not paying attention to sort of the complexities that that exist. We can sort of overgeneralize. We can sort of apply lessons from some other place to here, and that's sort of a cross-cultural kind of error. And then this whole idea of cause and effect is actually really tough to determine. At best, most of the relationships that we're thinking about are sort of correlational. So these are things that just sort of happen to occur at the same time. And how confident can we really be in sort of that cause and effect relationship? So the historical analysis section of the paper is really asking sort of four questions. And I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to pause the video real quick. All right, sorry about that. So the historical analysis section really asks sort of four questions. What has been done previously to ameliorate the social problem? How else has the problem been dealt with in the past? And frankly, one of the answers to that question might be, well, nothing has been done in the past to try and combat this problem. The third question a historical analysis asked is, how did the policy develop? Who initiated it? Who opposed it? What kinds of iterations did it go through? What kind of amendments were added? What kinds of disagreements were had over the content of the policy? And then the fourth sort of question is arguably the most difficult question to answer. And that question really asks, to what extent does the policy in its current form incorporate the lessons of the past? And so the two sort of operative questions in that question, in that sort of superordinate question, is, what are the lessons of history, and how are they reflected in the current policy? So this is also discussed in the book. I removed one of the questions, but you could pause the video here if you want to, and take some notes or take a screenshot if you wanted to, or you could just use the listing from the book. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.